start off with the lady who has the final say, who makes the tough decisions every single day. You must be pretty smart, cause your name starts with doctor. And if you think I'm doing drugs, you come and search my locker. When you get a red slip, you know what's gonna happen. You take that dreaded shameful walk to see old man Tappin'. And you already know what you're going there for. Just check out the silly quote right outside his door. The secretaries we all know really run this place. You better not be late or they'll be on your case. Thank God for those two counselors who keep us all in line. They get us in the right classes so we graduate on time. Mr. Lumblad, you're always cracking jokes and you never come off cross. But the reason you even have a job's cause you're married to the boss. And you, Mr. Southern, you must constantly live in fear. After all, I've been dating your daughter for over a year.
They're the Wildcat staff at LHS. Teaching us all day probably causes lots of stress. But you should be grateful cause it's kind of a big deal that we spend all our free time writing a song for your meal.
If I mention every teacher by their name, this song would last forever and it would really hurt my brain. So we mention each department from math to PE, and we'll start with the 4 subjects that are on the ACT. The math teachers tell us what pi really means, but you might as well give up cause we like our pie with whipped cream. Our science teachers teach us important life lessons by asking lots of stupid and really confusing questions. If a man jumps off a building who weighs 200 pounds, what will his velocity be when he hits the ground? Who gives a crap about velocity? He should kiss his butt goodbye, cause when he hits the ground, I predict that he will die. If you like to read and write a good essay, the English teachers will make you write one every day. And we all know Shakespeare was a pretty decent guy, but reading his boring plays sometimes makes us want to cry. Spanish is the other language that's a lot more fun to speak, and you even have parties like every other week. But they don't call them parties, they call them fiestas instead, cause if Lumblad was a party, the teachers would be dead.
They're the Wildcat staff at LHS. Teaching us all day probably causes lots of stress. But you should be grateful cause it's kind of a big deal that we spend all our free time writing a song for your meal.
From painting to stained glass, our art teachers help us see that if we weren't creative, how boring our world would be. Math, science, and English, what's all that you say? They would rather draw pictures and make things out of clay. The PE teachers, they help us to escape sitting in boring classrooms, and they keep us all in shape. You're not even really teachers is what some people say, but that's just cause they're jealous that you play games all day. We're grouping these next classes into a few different parts, from computers and business to culinary arts. If you would rather type than use pencil and paper, these are the teachers you would probably prefer. If you think about it, it's kind of funny too, cause we probably know more about computers than any of you do.
They're the Wildcat staff at LHS. Teaching us all day probably causes lots of stress. But you should be grateful cause it's kind of a big deal that we spend all our free time writing a song for your meal.
Why study history? It happened way back when. Cause apparently if we don't, bad things will happen again. But bad things happen anyway, no matter what we do. So let's get rid of all those history books and study something new. music's very important, I hope you do agree. From playing an instrument and learning to sing on key, life without music would really be a bore. Imagine watching Rocky without a music score. These next few teachers prefer working with wood. Forget those old textbooks, they won't do you any good. Cutting steel and welding takes a lot of preparation. So does getting ready for artificial insemination.
They're the Wildcat staff at LHS. Teaching us all day probably causes lots of stress. But you should be grateful, cause it's kind of a big deal that we spend all our free time writing a song for your meal. We could have been out chasing girls or making sparkler bombs. Instead we wrote this ballad for dear old Sally and Tom.